to everyone today. I am really excited to be joining this esteemed panel with Mota, Andra, and Bogosi, and Lerato as we talk about purpose and impact and what it means for business every day. So, as Lerato said, I work at Deloitte. I basically drive our internal purpose function, which is trying to make our purpose of making an impact that matters as part of our everyday business decision making. But what I'm going to take you through over my next 15 minutes or so is just a few principles and insights that I've learned along the way over the last couple of years. When we go into the panel discussion, I'll share more examples from a Deloitte perspective. But as I thought about this brief, I really felt like there are some base principles that are really helpful to understand when we talk about impact and business, in the context of today. So just bear with me for a little bit as I take you on a bit of a journey. So if we look at where we are today, sitting now in 2023, we pretty much sit at a precipice as society. Okay, we've just come off a harrowing pandemic. We know that we have a climate emergency, which is dire and requires immediate action. There are increasing levels of social inequality and decreasing levels of social cohesion. You know, when you look at any news site, I was going to say crack open a newspaper, but I don't think any one of us really physically open newspapers any longer, but you go onto a news site and you scroll through the headlines. It is very clear that there are a multitude of different things that are going on in society today. And really, where we want to move towards is an environment where business, society, government, everyone, has an opportunity to thrive. And I mean, one of the best, I think, articulations of looking at what the future of the world could be is if we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which talks about things like zero hunger and no poverty and, reducing inequalities and making sure that there's gender parity, et cetera, et cetera. So there's clearly, a direction that we want to move towards. And we've made some great strides over the last couple of years in the work that business has done. But the question that remains really is, what is the role of business in society from taking us from where we currently are to where we could potentially be as a thriving society living on a planet, with the resources that we have? How do we ensure that we get there, and what can business do? And that's really where I like to sort of sit and pause and almost think to myself, well, what is the purpose of business? And it's probably going to be a word that you'll hear a lot that I'll say in this presentation, and I'm sure it will come up in our panel. But at the crux of it, purpose, or the purpose of business, is the reason that it exists. So, cutting out all of the jargon and everything around it, it's the reason why it exists. So if we go back, for a long time ago, why did businesses come together? It's because society had needs and wants. We needed to move from A to B, and we wanted to do so with autonomy. And so there was a need to create cars and manufacture these cars en masse. And so you couldn't do it on your own, but you knew that there are individuals who could pull together resources and skills, and an organization was formed in order to do that. In the same way, there was a need for clothing, or whatever the case is. But businesses, at their very core, serve the needs and wants of society through the products they have and through the services that they provide. But somewhere along the way, things went a little bit awry, in that instead of keeping the needs and wants of society at the forefront, profit became the primary objective, and in many cases at any cost. And that caused a problem, right? Because the idea that we have a business in order to make money at any cost starts becoming really concerning when it comes at the cost of the impact on people and on planet. And I think at the height of it in the 70s, there was an economist, Milton Friedman, who talked about the fact that the business of business should just be business. The idea that profits are the socially responsible thing for business to do, and it doesn't need to consider anything else. But the reality is that today, we are seeing what I had on that very gloomy gray slide, the long-term consequences of short-term decisions that were taken all those years ago. And so we stand at a very exciting point in time where we have the opportunity to really make an impact and use business as a force for good, use business as the impetus to be able to really make positive change in society. And I'm not suggesting that we do this in a philanthropic way or a charitable way. I'm suggesting that we do this in a way that's good for business and good for society. So that's what I want to unpack in a couple of minutes today. Oh, sorry, I don't know. There we go. Okay, so I want to go through, and I'm going to borrow from Simon Sinek's Start With Why framework here to say, let's look at purposeful business and understand why is there an imperative for purposeful business? Why should it happen? How does it actually materialize? What does that look like in practice? And finally, who? And this was a prompt that Bogosi had given me when we chatted earlier in the week. He was like, who actually drives purpose in a business? So we're going to go through a few of these concepts. If we start with the why, which is the imperative, and I realize that I'm blocking the screen here, but hopefully you'll be able to see behind me. It really sits with the idea that it's about responsibility and doing the right thing. And I know that sounds like a cliche, and you probably roll your eyes like, okay, it's the right thing to do. But really it is. I mean, we're sitting at a point in time where some organizations are larger than entire nation states, right? They have an impact that is humongous in the number of people they employ, the way that they impact societies through the services that they have, through the products that they have, right? So the idea that business has to consider the wider impact and being mindful of that impact is something that really sits in the fact that it is the right thing to do, given the influence, given the inextricable link that business has with society. But the reality also is that stakeholders demand it, right? Increasingly, we find that stakeholders, both inside and outside of an organization, are expecting more of business. We've seen increasing activism activities with shareholders, specifically asking questions around ESG, asking questions around the ethical practices of a business. Whether it's the consumers who have changing habits that ask more probing questions to understand where is this product really coming from and what was the implications within the supply chain for this product to land up in my cupboard. I want to make sure that it went through a clean process, so to speak. And increasingly, within our own organizations, each one of us here sitting within organizations, we want to work for companies that understand what their purpose is and want to really contribute to society beyond just making a profit. And for me, I think that's a really powerful intrinsic motivation for companies really to look at this. Their own staff, and increasingly Gen Zs and millennials. I'm scanning the room, and I know there's a whole bunch of you out there, but Gen Zs and millennials, trying to finding their purpose and meaning personally by looking for jobs that resonate with their values as well. And the bottom line is that it makes good business sense, right? So this isn't just about looking at it from the factors of responsibility or stakeholder expectations, but all of that rolls into businesses that serve well into the long term, that create resilient businesses, that have reputations and trusted relationships with society, with their customers, and with their employees. So I hope this provides a bit of a picture on the imperative behind purposeful business. And then we take a step back and say, okay, fine, if this is the why, then what is the how? What is that shift that needs to happen? And up on there, I know this is a bit of a wordplay, but it is about an intentional rather than an incidental shift. This is about a very deliberate mindset that we need to have as people working within our organizations to understand that purpose can be the lever for growth, that it has the potential to be. And the first one, if you can see it in the corner there, is that as a business, we exist within an ecosystem. This for me is a really important concept because it really speaks to the fact that any one of us, whether you're talking about Nestle or KFC or any one of the organizations that we have, we exist as a business that sits on a planet with finite resources, that interacts with communities and societies that are gloriously complex and diverse and complicated, but that is the environment that we exist in. Business has to operate and thrive in that context. And as much as it impacts society and impacts the planet, so whether you're thinking about carbon emissions that an organization puts forward through its production or the products that it puts out there, it also has dependencies. You don't have to think too far back. We had flooding in KZN, I think it was last year or the year before, that had a massive impact on many small businesses and large businesses in KZN. In the same province, when there was civil unrest, the instability in society had a huge impact on business. So there's a dependency factor that comes in and also an impact. So the bottom line is that business doesn't exist in a silo, it exists within the context of an ecosystem. So that's the first element of that mindset shift. The other one is that a long-term view is needed as we think about business and impact. So for those of you who are part of our brand and marketing space, this is not about what is the story that we tell for today, but it's the story that we will tell for generations to come, or the legacy that we may leave for generations to come. About understanding that when we make these decisions as a business, as a strategic choice, it's thinking about the impact today, but also the impact that we will leave in the long term. And I think that's really where this idea of how does profit and purpose play together is that, yes, there sometimes are trade-offs that one makes in the short term, but in the longer term, the reputational impact, the resilience of societies, that all builds towards business's favor. And I'll take you through that in a second. And the last aspect here, and this is my favorite one, is that purpose is an impetus and not an impediment for growth and for opportunity. So traditionally, when people talked about the responsibility of business, or looking at responsible business, or corporate social responsibility, it very much sat at the periphery of business, right? So you would do something in your operations, you would have clear products and services, and the corporate social responsibility was something that sat on the side as a side initiative. But that idea is changing and evolving, as we move forward in understanding the role of business in society. In the very products that you put out there as a business, in the very services that you provide, that is where the lens of purpose should come through. And using that lens, you find growth and opportunity, as a I would say, almost like a motivation, to be able to find how we solve the needs and wants of society in a way that is, in fact, responsible. So all of this is to line up to what I find is a really neat quote that I want to share with you. And I find that this quote encompasses what it means to be a purposeful, responsible business that considers its impact, but in a way that isn't necessarily just philanthropic, but brings it to the core of the business. So, and this is a little bit of a tongue twister, so just bear with me for a second. So it's really about the fact that the purpose of business should be to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people and planet. So lots of P's. But just pause on that quote. Just pause on that quote, right? We're not, for those of you who might have been skeptical to say, oh dear, you guys are talking about philanthropy, but I'm a business person. This is really important. Profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. Because the reality is that in order for a business to continue doing the good work that it does, to make the impact that it makes, it has to be financially sustainable. It has to be able to attract the top talent. It has to be able to reinvest in its business, to do the R&D, to make sure that the products that it puts out there are of a high quality. So it is about saying that, yes, you need to be profitable. However, you have to do this in a responsible way. And that's the second part of the definition, which says not to profit from producing problems. So what's an example of that? If you are a car manufacturer and you cut corners by, reducing the quality of the parts that you use in order to make a profit today, but you compromise on the safety of the car that you put out there tomorrow, that means that when consumers use the car, it impacts them in a negative way. So that is not an idea of purposeful business, right? Purposeful business is about ensuring that you balance your purpose and your profit. And I like to think of profit as being very much a byproduct of a business or a company that lives its purpose. So practically, what this looks like in the context of an organization is saying that you firstly need to have clarity on what your purpose is. I'll use my own organization as an example. At Deloitte, we talk about having a purpose that is making an impact that matters for our people, for our clients, for society. And we have a multidisciplinary business. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, we're a professional services firm that provides audit services, consulting services, advisory services, and we do this for other businesses. So we're a B2B, we're not necessarily providing it to the end consumer. But when we think about our purpose, we have to think about it in the actual services that we provide and what impact are we making through those services on the businesses that we work with, but also ultimately on the public interest. So the first thing is to say that have a purpose that is clearly understood and well articulated, because that purpose needs to go everywhere in the organization and be understood across the board. It has to be embedded from the very top, where you set your strategy as a business, all the way through to when you communicate it to your stakeholders. So I know a lot of you in the room today are brand and marketing professionals, and I know that many of you are involved in advertising campaigns, for example. And I'm sure that one of the key principles to engage with your consumer is authenticity, right? You can't tack on purpose or impact as an afterthought. That is not authenticity. Authenticity is bringing it in from the conceptualization of the idea. So if you're marketing a product, what was the thinking of impact and purpose from the very conceptualization of the design of the product all the way through to when you're trying to sell it to the consumer? And this is a really important concept, and one that I hope we'll share a bit more on during our panel discussion, but bringing it into those core business decisions and not necessarily seeing it as an afterthought all the way at the end. And then coming to this last component, and then I'll stop in a moment because I realize I'm running through time. But who in the business should drive purpose? And there we go. I think there's two answers to this. Is that it definitely has to be a top-down approach, meaning that leadership needs to buy into this, right? Leadership at the very top levels of the organization, they set the tone. You know, people talk about the tone at the top. They need to understand and they need to give direction through the strategy that as a business, we are considered and concerned about the impact that we make on our stakeholders, the way that we run our business on our employees, the way that we interact with our suppliers. That has to sit at the top. But equally important is that it has to be from the bottom up as well, which means that every single one of us in an organization needs to understand the purpose of the organization that we're part of. Because, you know, if I go back to the principle that we talked about, that purpose should be an impetus for growth. The best way that it's an impetus for growth is if everyone understands it and finds opportunities to innovate with that purpose lens in mind. And that innovation doesn't always come from the top levels of an organization. That innovation comes from people who are on the ground, who are on the factory floors, people who are, you know, part of middle management. So the purpose isn't something that is just stuck up on a placard that's posted in the hallway when you enter an organization. It is something that is felt through the organization in everything that one does. And I think for me, I feel really passionately about this, you know, and I will say this as a millennial myself, that for me, going to work in an organization where I feel a sense of personal purpose is incredibly important for me, right? And this idea of linking or resonating personal purpose as an employee with the purpose of an organization, I think is a really strong argument when we think about the context of how we make a real difference as a business. So all of this to say, and I realize that's been quite a bit, and it might seem a little bit overwhelming. The reality is that you don't have to have the perfect map. You don't necessarily have to have all of this put together in a clear blueprint. What you do need is a direction. And I think that sometimes people often look at this idea of being more purposeful or more intentional in the way that business is done as, oh, I might not get this all right. And I'll tell you this much, every business is on a journey. But the point is that we know what the right direction is. And when you know better, you will do better. But you have to start somewhere. Thank you very much. I hope that you enjoy that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.